Hello and welcome to this video on the Expert Sleepers Pandora, a fully analogue combination of bandpass filtering, distortion, feedback and parallel processing. Let's check out what's to come in the video. This video is sponsored by Expert Sleepers. Pandora is an interesting combination of MOSFET transistors and vactrols. The vactrols form part of this filtering, and it's a bandpass filter with alpha and beta controls that form the separate corner frequencies of a bandpass filter. If you've ever used a low-pass filter and a high-pass filter to create a bandpass before, you'll know that you can bring in these frequencies to create small bands, wide bandwidths, shift just one side of the band around, and just contract, expand and compress and get really creative with your patching. And I'll certainly be talking about this filter as if it's separate low passing and high passing. I find it to be an interesting musical approach to this bandpass filter. The MOSFET distortion can be warm right through to fuzzy in tone, and we can use that like a VCA using things like envelopes to bring in the level of our sound. We have feedback and a mix control, and we can configure the mix to be a standard linear dry-wet blend, or a blend where both signals are at max level in the middle, perfect for parallel processing where you may want to zone in a bandwidth of distorted fedback frequencies and blend that against the dry for things like low-end enhancement or kind of grit and drive in the mids and highs in your patching. So let's take a more detailed look at these controls. So here's Pandora with controls for alpha, beta, gain, feed and mix, CVs for all of those, a high and low switch, and an input and an output. Now we'll start with an input, which is blue trace here, plug in our output, and we'll use the mix to blend across to this dry input sound. Going fully wet, we have gain, which we can use like a VCA by plugging envelopes in and things like that, but this is the gain for this MOSFET distortion stage. So while it does work as a VCA, you can also use this as a voltage controlled distortion. And you can see it squares off this ramp wave nicely and asymmetrically. We've got more negative clipping than positive clipping there on that wave. Alpha and beta then make up the corner frequencies of this bandpass filter, alpha dealing in the upper frequencies like a low pass would, and these control vactrols for these frequencies, so a quick flick of that knob. It's kind of a nice gentle musical lag to some of that control. Beta controls the lower part of this bandpass frequency in terms of its bandwidth there, much like a high pass. Feed is feedback, which we can think of as resonant here. And it's certainly keen to self-oscillate. As I say, CV over everything, and low and high there, that low switch will push these frequencies down several octaves. Perfect for pinging sub-audio booms, 808 kicks, and slewing, wave shaping and resonating CV inputs as well. We'll have some fun with that later in the video. The timing index is on screen, so skip around as you see fit, and let's dive into some patches. So here Pandora is really adding some spice and life and excitement to an otherwise fairly flat beat. Going fully wet on Pandora. Low end is smashed. Little feedback burps, some nice modulation. In parallel, I'm really enjoying myself. This is simply distorting the beat. And then I'm using a sequence to make this gain dance around between kind of more or less distortion on certain steps. I'm then adding this choppy 16th note envelope here to feedback. Nice kind of burpy feedback hits. And that in parallel. So here I'm using Pandora like a back end for a synth voice, or rather a back end for an oscillator, finishing off the audio path of a synth voice. There's some effects, which we'll kill for now. And I'm using an envelope to open the gain, which will fully close. So I'm simply using this like a VCA. And I'm using some mix modulation to alpha. So this is like a low pass filter VCA combination. This envelope is what's going into gain. It's pushing into this drive and distortion, but as it's a pulse input, you can't really distort a square any further. Filtering this back, I'm using a mixer here to mix my modulation, and using a split of this envelope into the mixer, we'll feed that to the low pass. And the green trace is what's coming out of this mixer to modulate alpha. So a little bit of envelope there, and I have an LFO on 2. Just cycling round. So a blend of envelope and LFO. And we get these unsynced swells and pushes. Works through the octaves of this oscillator really nicely. Bring the effects back in. So low pass filter with some mixed modulation. VCA using the gain and an envelope. Nice simple back end for a synth voice. Now here we can use Pandora as a bandpass filter. The green trace here is my square wave input, blue trace is the output of Pandora. Bringing in some level there, nice low square. If we do some high passing and some low passing, we can then move a band around. It's physically awkward trying to do that with 2 knobs at once. You could use a voltage to both of them, which would be the sensible thing to do. But I'm going to have some fun here by creating a band and then using rubber bands and bands, to get the knobs to move together. So there we have a rubber band bandpass with this kind of added slew non-linearity of the tension of the rubber band. Now could add some feedback for some resonance, and you'll notice while it oscillates at lower frequencies, the oscillation disappears as we go higher up the frequencies. So with that in mind, let's use another rubber band, a double rubber band bandpass, as stupid as that sounds, so that we can add feedback as we turn up and bring the feedback down as we go back down. Now I realise that's ridiculous, but it's a good bit of double rubber band bandpass. Fun. So here we're looking at some sub-bass shaping. Sine waves mates for greater subs, so sine wave shaping here with Pandora. And hitting pause, green trace here is my sine wave coming in from this oscillator, blue trace is the output. We'll remove the modulation for now, and I'm in the low mode. Just gave me a distortion I kind of prefer the tone of, just this really kind of tubby, thick sound. Now adding in my modulation, this is a looping envelope where the looping is being gated on and off. I have a volt per octave sequence to pitch here. Now although we're processing bass, if we bring the beta up here, which is the high pass, then add some feedback. And get all sorts of destructive interaction. Oof, let's try that against the drums. It's intense. So this is Pandora filtering, distorting, moving wavetables. It's going through some big reverb here, which is only on around 30% wet. Let's kill the effects and go dry. I'll let you listen for a second. I'm then modulating the two filters, some drive and feedback. And data there, those nice shapes it's drawing, these Lissajous curves, is the difference between the dry sound and the wet processed Pandora sound. So not only does this sound good, it looks good too. These LFOs are being attenuated, just to kind of get these filters moving in less of a wide range. Effects back in. Again, 25-30% wet. You're mainly hearing this Pandora processed wavetable. So here we're using Pandora as a kick. Switch it into the lower frequency mode, and the manual suggests some settings of 10 for alpha, 5.5 for beta, 5 for gain, 3 for feedback, and that gets you into this kick drum territory. Now remove my other drums. Now this is certainly really low, you're going to want some good headphones or speakers on for this. We can expand this by adding envelopes, either ones that are triggered in time, or be creative by modulating on other steps in your sequences, for example. Here's an envelope to beta, which is going to act like a pitch envelope. It's coming through this attenuator. And you can hear it gives us this more kind of impactful sound. It's making that pitch higher, so you might have to then start that bit lower. And again, it's a bit of a balancing act. Gain will affect how much of that trigger comes through. Much softer sounds there, or much more clicky ones. Other drums back in. So here we're exploring AM synthesis, amplitude modulation and the overtones that creates. It's a little bit like ring modulation by modulating the gain, and I'm having some fun making the alpha part of this filter, the low pass side, dance around with an envelope. Now pulling out the filter modulation, here's these nice AM tones, and it's just a triangle wave and a sine wave. This is the difference between the two parts. And removing my gain modulation there, this is what's coming into the input. a simple quarter note sequence that's just repeating around. I then have a modulator, which is this sequence, just a basic minor arpeggio. And now the input, and the arpeggiator, or the arpeggio, is now the modulator. Again, bring up the level. This great AM tone. And as we're modulating gain, the VCA, we could do things like tremolo by modulating with an LFO. That's on channel 2 there on my mixer. So let's have some of this and this AM. Really complex, rich tone. Bringing the filter back down. Let's add some of this envelopes kind of dancing around randomly. So here I'm using Pandora as a really rich, organic and moving, just great sounding feedback path around an otherwise really clean delay. I remove my dry sound, which is in my external mixer here. And this is a fully wet, clean digital delay. I'm first bringing my dry sound into a mixer, and the mixer's output feeds the delay. I'm then splitting, in this splitter cable, the output of the delay, one to my external mixer so we can hear this fully wet delay, and another through Pandora back into the mixer so I can then create that feedback loop feeding back into this delay. Now I have some modulation of the filters here. Let's remove those for now. Let's go for something higher here. Finding all these really lovely sweet spots. It just sounds great. It's got this really nice kind of saturated old tape delay style sound. Now if I add some modulation in, start getting these filters dancing, and these are some attenuated LFOs to alpha the low pass and beta the high pass. I'm going to remove the drive from feeding the effects. And you can just hear this feedback loop. Manually riding that gain as the filters are just dancing around. Just sounds great. I love feedback loops. I love saturation. Can Pandora be an LFO? In a word, yes. My sound is an oscillator going through a phaser, going through a filter, and I'm just using the filter like a volume control while I'm talking. Here's bringing that sound up, and simply turning up the feedback and letting that modulate the shape of the oscillator and the frequency of the phaser. There we have an LFO. The switch is in low mode. Now lower feedback will not only change the rate, but it will smooth out that waveform and diminish and attenuate its output. Have a higher amplitude output with more feedback. But listen and watch how that shape and rate changes as I crank the feedback up. Alpha and beta are interactive as well. So we could have some fun throwing LFOs at the feedback and those filter controls. And you can see in here, we end up with all sorts of quite chaotic behaviours from just freely modulating this. So as we've seen that Pandora can be an LFO, I wondered what it was like processing LFOs. And filters we can often use as slews if they're DC coupled and will work at sub-audio rates. So here's my sound coming through a low pass filter with a little bit of reverb. So setting the filter, I'm going to mix across to the dry input. And the triangle in just comes through. As I go to Pandora's output here, add some level. We can see we have a wave-shaped version of this triangle. We can really clip that out quite nicely. And the alpha there, which you can think of as that low-pass filter cutoff, Works like a slew, rounding out these edges, turning this triangle into a sine-like wave. We then start to high pass or bring that lower point in with beta. Get these interesting wobbles as we're cutting into the kind of fundamental of this triangle. With some feedback, we can emphasize these wobbles. So we turned Pandora into an LFO. We then processed LFOs through Pandora. Now let's process envelopes, because a basic envelope in is giving this cool little Pandora wobble party on the way out. Now here's the input. Modulating a low-pass filter's cutoff that's external to the module. If I turn feedback down, we can get a clipped version of our envelope. We can slew it with the alpha control. Still turning it into a bipolar wave, which is interesting. Gain here will have a big effect. You can see after each peak of the envelope it ducks and kind of comes back up in energy. Gives this nice kind of sucking push and pull. But what gets really interesting is when we start to high pass with the beta control, like we did with our LFO example. We're getting these kind of kinks and wobbles we can emphasize with feedback. But I like this envelope interrupting these wobbles. We're finding these more kind of organic, chaotic, lively modulation sources. So here Pandora's been used as a back-end distorter, shaper, dual filter, high pass and low pass there. For an oscillator, it's simply a kind of rounded ramp or saw wave coming in, and then lots of modulation to animate it. Sounds great in this big verb, but let's kill the effects. Now again, this is my input wave here coming in. And with that input gain, we can push this into that squaring off MOSFET distortion. Feed works like resonance, feedback, and beta there working as our high pass. Now we'll start by using an envelope to modulate alpha, the low pass filter's cutoff. Then going to add an LFO to beta, the high pass cutoff. Let's then start to add some random modulation over gain, feedback and the mix. So here's that exact same patch with the addition of the vobble octave to my oscillator here. And all those deep feedback swells just make for a really quirky pitch sequence. Effects back in. So here Pandora's been used much more subtly as a bandpass filter, and I'm also going to bring in some nice down-sampled style audio rate AM effects. Now it's all built around this controller here, which is providing an offset voltage on this knob. That sweeps up both filters together, so this band moves alpha and beta coming up to higher frequencies, and it opens up a VCA, allowing this audio rate modulation through to the gain for amplitude modulation or AM. As I bring this voltage back down, it closes that VCA, the modulation disappears, that crunchy overtone. And as I go negative in voltage, we're closing down these bands to lower frequencies and pumping up the amount of reverb on my effects module. If I add in a little bit of LFO here, it just gives us really delicate control of this lovely soft band that we can get from Pandora. It's not all about the filth. Say we're using Pandora as a kind of post-mix, mix enhancer, tonal shaper, distorter, parallel thickener. Now what you're hearing is in my mixer here, and it's completely dry. Basic 606 style drum break. And a simple square into a resonant filter pattern, just looping around. Now Pandora has its own mix with this little mixer used like a send effect, so it's taking splits of the drums and bass into this mixer and feeding Pandora, and then that's coming in separately here, mix up full on this mixer. So I can do things like distort the kick drum there, focusing in on that low end, and then blending this with the dry sound. Now all these examples will be really over-egged for the sake of this video, but you could back the gain off, be much more subtle, and use this like a bass boost. Likewise, removing the dry here, we could find the top end, we've got that kind of snap of the clap right on that feedback point, and blend that in. Doing this with the bass. Adding masses of thickness. And in the headphones, I'm sensing this presence of lots of low end before I'm hearing it sound distorted, which it definitely is. So you can use Pandora to focus in on different frequency areas, distort them, feedback them, and use that like a mix enhancer in parallel. And doing so with a subtle amount underneath this mix or patch mix can work wonders for bringing in and highlighting certain elements of what you're doing in the rest of the system. Thanks for checking out this video on Pandora. I hope it's given you some ideas of how to use the module and also some patch ideas you can apply in your own systems. If you'd like to support me, you can do so on patreon.com/DivKid, where you'll gain access to exclusive PDF patch books, exclusive videos, posts, and access to the DivKid Discord community. Hit like and subscribe, and leave a comment with any questions or things you'd like to highlight from the video. I'd be interested to know which was your favourite patch and favourite sound that you've heard from Pandora. See you next time. Bye.